Hi, everyone. This is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman. And today we have a very special episode because we're going to be talking about sibling estrangement and why it's so common in our society. So, more and more, we're observing that people are opening up about their sibling estrangement experiences and speaking out about what happened to them. It doesn't take long to recognize this. Once we bring up the subject of family, a sudden silence can overtake us, or a feeling of discomfort can wash over us. So, today, what we're going to be doing is talking about why this social phenomenon has been ever growing and why it's becoming increasingly common on a worldwide scale. So, Fern, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you. When I originally wrote Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, and the book came out in 2021, we toyed with the subtitle and whether or not we should use the word estrangement in it, because it wasn't as much of a thing then as it is now. And in some ways, I think it has ridden the coattails of these words that are commonly words of the year, like narcissism, gaslighting, and people are much more familiar now with the concept of estrangement. And in addition, they're talking about it more, so it's less stigmatized and a little more out in the open. But there are all sorts of larger trends, social trends that are occurring in the family and in the world that have sadly perpetuated estrangement.
Absolutely, and I think that that's important for us to get it that talk going with regards to that because I think that this is becoming more to the forefront, right? And I think more and more people are becoming more estrangement informed, right? In terms of what the elements of estrangement actually look like, what it is that we may need, of course, to feel heard and understood, but also to understand where things break down fundamentally when it comes to estrangement and such. So I think that that's really, really important to look at that and such. And maybe one thing I want to mention, of course, before we get started is there are, of course, good reasons to estrange. This is, of course, something that happens that's a personal process for each person. And it takes courage for people to recognize that they may be experiencing a toxic situation with a sibling or any other family member for that matter. So people that do choose to estrange don't do it lightly. So I just want to mention that even though we're going to be getting into some of those reasons, we of course want to offer our full respect and sympathy to the people that have to make this choice for their own good.
And there are really important reasons to make that choice, including violence and when it's a constant injurious relationship. Um, Oh, the list is long, and at the moment I'm not thinking
Yes.
of every single one of them. But I think another reason is even authenticity and whether or not you can be your authentic self around somebody else. And that's not to say you make that choice lightly, but sometimes when you feel that twisted and tormented, it's impossible to sustain the relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's sometimes what happens, of course, you have to protect yourself for your own good. And, there's all sorts of reasons why people experience estrangement as well, and I think it's good to look at this on a sociological level, of course, where we can take a bit of the pulse when it comes to that. And I think one of the things that we were talking about previously was this idea that there's a rise of individualism, especially, right? There's this idea that, we're part of a disposable culture, right? When something doesn't work, we usually throw it away, right? Even with cars and such, right? I mean, it's you get parts fixed, and we usually we say we get them fixed, but really what we're doing is we're changing the part that's broken to replace it, right?
Right. That's true. And also the family itself is going through probably the greatest metamorphosis in human history. And the causes are economic and cultural and institutional all at the same time.
Yeah,
So these pressures on the family and on individuals in the family are having a big consequence. And a lot
absolutely.
of times it's broken relationships.
Absolutely. There's a lot of pressure coming from different places and such, like you say. And, I think that with the rise of individualism, there's this idea that if people disagree with you, that they're somehow disrespecting you and that they're at fault for doing so. So I think that that's the issue that happens with some people that may cause estrangement as well, is that people hold on to grudges, right? Instead of actually just trying to work things out, when it comes to certain things.
Right. I've heard a lot of my own clients saying that they have been encouraged by young therapists to cut off from the family. Now, whether or not that's true is certainly debatable, but I think there is a mentality that, like you said, that if you're not fulfilled in these relationships, it's not necessary to sustain them.
Hmm.
And, we're no longer living in an agrarian culture where everybody has to work for the sake of the family.
Exactly, right. We're branching out a lot more now in that sense, right? People may be moving away. People may be, of course, going elsewhere for jobs. Their own sustenance and survival doesn't depend on the family anymore, right?
They also are repudiating marriage or they're delaying having children. And all of these factors are changing the face of the family.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that sense, of course, there's economic reasons behind that as well, too. And in some ways, of course, the choices that people make sometimes can, of course, be reflective of that as well. But definitely, I find that there's a sense of change that's happening with family and the types of relationships that people have. Sometimes are more temporary, or that at the same time, whatever grudges or issues that are happening, end up taking the forefront. And I think that that's the thing that happens, because a lot of times when people experience these types of situations, usually the reflex would be to talk it out. But avoidance has become the norm, I think, a lot with dealing with other people, right? And I think that's one of the things that happens, right? And it's easier for some people to ignore the issue, walk away, avoid it, instead of actually speaking about it. Because a lot of times people in our community, they've said that they don't even know the reasons why they're being estranged.
Right. Ghosting and avoidance. Also, I think a lot of families and young people have not learned social skills. They have not learned how to sustain communication. And as a result, it's showing up in these family relationships.
Well, we can just think about texting and such, right? I mean, especially now when we look at texting and technology and such, right? I mean, texting seems to be the preferred method of communication for certain generations, much more than actually picking up the phone and having a conversation. So all of that is changing in terms of how it is that we're affected, right?
And the danger in texting is that there's a lot of misinterpretation. Personally, I think the only thing you should text is "I'll see you on Saturday." But you start getting into these topics that have a lot of emotional context, and it's dangerous. There's a lot of room for misinterpretation.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that this has been some of the issues that I've seen with some clients as well, and I think it takes a certain level of emotional maturity with regards to sticking it out and talking about certain thorny issues and such, but because some defensive mechanisms are really strong for some people, it's really hard for them to get beyond that, and they unfortunately get stuck in their own situation or become really emotionally overwhelmed, and the response is, I'm going to cut you out, basically. And it's sad to see that when this happens with some people, because a lot of people are left, I think, distraught because of that, right?
Yeah, and I wanted to go back to this idea of texting. You've basically eliminated tone and you've eliminated verbal cues so as a result, you're basing your interpretation on a very narrow band of information,
Yep.
just words,
Yeah.
without any intonation.
Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes some words may not necessarily be spoken or mentioned appropriately or used in accordance because of interpretation, what that word may mean, etc. So there's a lot of room for interpretation and misunderstanding if we're not careful, right? And I also think that in some ways, I think people are more prone to feeling in competition also, I think nowadays, especially with the speed at which life is going. a lot of times, as we're saying the family's been changing and mutating, I think, a lot since the olden days. And this is something that's happening more and more, is that people actually feel it sometimes even in competition with their own family, right? And they try to gain the upper hand on people within their family.
By nature, these sibling relationships are rivalrous, so it's not surprising that you might see intense competition as they turn into adults. And yeah, and there's so many factors. There's divorce, which also plays into this. Families used to be glued by these lifelong marriages, and you could count on these people being a part of your life, and that's just not the case anymore. And people are having fewer offspring. That's another factor. So there's a lot that plays into this.
Absolutely, and I think that that's the thing too, is that sometimes when there are certain differences in chemistry and things of that nature, when you just don't necessarily get along or jive with a particular sibling, especially if families are smaller, it leaves you with less options, right? And I think that in some cases, as we were saying earlier, with the rise of individualism, I think there's this idea of simply wanting to be right. And some siblings, won't hesitate to use family against other people simply because they want to be right or want to gain a sense of affection or attention, or simply getting some sort of approval of some sort. And unfortunately, a lot of people can weaponize the relationship.
Yeah, I think that that's a case, definitely the case that where you see these flying monkeys and all sorts of behaviors that are really toxic.
Mhm.
Um, but in addition, I think siblings are freer than ever to establish their own set of rules now as to whether they're going to ignore each other or they're going to create distance. Um, and that's changed everything as well, especially if you factor in proximity. Once people move away, they've really dialed down the connection.
Mhm. It's true that geographic differences can, of course, foster estrangement, and I think that especially if there's misunderstandings, there's no ability really to create any place to gain a sense of understanding or clarification in some ways, especially when there is a sense of geographical distance, and factor in that people are bringing in their own personalities and their own individual traits as well when it comes to that. It makes it hard to get the sense that you can get what you want ultimately in a sibling relationship if people are just too rigid, right? And too focused on themselves, instead of actually working out and trying to find a sense of community within the family or with their siblings. So,
Or commitment.
yeah.
Commitment. I mean, I think that's the piece we're talking about. Are siblings committed to sustaining lifelong relationships?
Exactly. And that's a big one right there too, right? Because if there's too much animosity or again, too many factors that, of course, play into the relationship, then in that sense, of course, it becomes parallel lives. And I use that term sometimes where people basically just have two different types of trajectories with each other, right? And
Right.
I think that's the thing, is that when people outgrow each other that way because they've been living parallel lives, it creates a sense of indifference, which unfortunately, because there's no common or shared experiences, makes that, of course, the distance and the estrangement is really what defines the relationship ultimately.
And a lot of it is rooted in childhood. What was your relationship like when you were children? So, for example, the research shows if there is more than 3 years between siblings, they have not had those shared experiences that are so deeply bonding. And particularly if they're 5 or 7 years, one child feels like a caregiver to the other, and there's a lot of resentment in that.
Yep.
So, what happened in childhood also is going to be a factor in how the relationship is as adults.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it reflects, especially in these key moments of development, right? If people have these types of experiences where they can look back on fond memories, or rather not look back, but rather have regret or apprehension perhaps, or frustrations and such, then yes, it makes it a whole lot difficult to build from that, because there's that sense of unfinished business, with that sibling, or an unevenness that eventually causes people to feel that they're drawing further apart with each other, you know?
You know, one of the other interesting things, Ali John, in the research too, is that cultures that are traditionally immigrant cultures, there is more of an obligation to maintain relationships and to honor the family. The research shows that families from traditionally immigrant cultures tend to feel an obligation to maintain relationships with their brothers and sisters to honor their parents. And so you don't see estrangement in working class and poor families and these immigrant families as often.
Yeah, and that's true to an extent. I would agree with you just as a general rule. But what's interesting also is that through the clash of the old world and the new world, we're starting to see some changes with that, right? Where all of a sudden there is estrangement with the prevailing family values that some people may have, and how they feel they must actualize themselves as individuals to be authentic, right? So I think that that's really, really important, of course, to note that that's happening even in our community. There's some talk about that, and there have been some people, of course, that are of a different ethnic background that are experiencing these types of situations, culturally speaking. You know. So Fern, we're almost out of time. I am noticing this. It's going to be good for us to, of course, talk about resources at this time. So, Fern, what would be your number one resource currently for our
Well,
viewers
I
to know
guess
about?
since I started by talking about brother sister strangers, sibling estrangement, and the road to reconciliation, I'll finish there as well, which is the memoir about that got me started in all this, and it is the memoir about my brothers and my estrangement and reconciliation, as well as other people's voices and some of the research that is out there on the topic.
Absolutely. And that's so, so important, of course, to have a source of understanding for ourselves and for our community in terms of knowing that there's some resources out there and places where we can feel understood and heard. And one such place for me is, of course, the Facebook group that I've created. Of course, we see the resources on screen. They talk about that, what the name of our Facebook group is and such, and how important it is, of course, to people that people can join to get a sense of belonging and sense of community and such that they may not be having their own lives. And another resource I want to talk about, of course, is my intensive workshop, of course, improving my self-esteem after sibling estrangement. That is something I'll be doing this fall. And I hope that, of course, people will join me if they want to have deeper, cutting edge experimental tools, experiential tools rather, that they can use, of course, that are well established and that can especially help when it comes to going through a situation like this where we can seek and need empowerment for ourselves. So that's really, really important, of course, to be able to offer some of these resources. I think that both you and I are able to bring out to the world because of the much needed, of course, needs that seem to be appearing in our community and such. So again, Fern, I'm really, really glad that we are able to sit together and talk about this and analyze some of the sociological needs, of course, and the emerging changes that come with family and sibling estrangement. So, again, thank you so much for being a part of this. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure, and we've done this without estranging one another, so pat ourselves on the back.
For sure. So, thank you so much for being a part of this, and I very much look forward to our next talk again.
Me too.
All right, take care.